This image was captured on Millennium Bridge in London, and it's slightly underexposed. I also want to try the double processing technique. I'm going to process it the first time for the shadows and take that into the main editing space of Photoshop. And then I'm going to revisit this Adobe Camera Raw file and then process it a second time for the sky. And we'll create a composite image from the same raw file inside of the main editing space. Okay, so let's first attempt to try and get rid of a lot of this underexposure in the foreground. And I'm not too concerned about the sky at this stage because I will reprocess that a second time for the sky. Okay, so I'm going to take the exposure slider and take that up a couple of stops. And I'm also going to open up some of the shadow detail as well by grabbing the shadow slider and raising that to a value of around about +30 or so. Okay, now we're going to add some contrast, okay, because it's getting a little bit flat, so I'm going to take that up to around about +70. Okay, so just a little bit more on there. And also we can raise some clarity, which also gives some localized contrast into this file. +25 should see this image really starting to take off now for that foreground information. And the colors are getting a little bit flat, so I'm going to raise the vibrant slider to +50. Because we've made a lot of significant adjustments to this image, it is probably worth checking we still have a good black point for the shadows inside of this image. I'm just going to hold down the Alt key on the PC or the Option key on a Mac and then click on this slider to see what clipping we have. Obviously, if we're getting too far down there and losing information, that's not ideal. So I'm just going to bring that over to the right slightly. And if we take a look just above the histogram as well, we can see that clipping warning turns black, which means to say that we don't have any significant clipping there now. Okay, because I've opened up the shadow details such extensively, I'm actually going to come over to the Detail tab. Okay, and we're going to zoom into actual pixels here. Okay, we can do that from this little menu here, or I can just use the keyboard shortcut Command Option 0 on a Mac or Control Alt 0 on a PC. Just going to hold down the spacebar and move around this image to have a look at the information. Now on your screens you may not see too much of the noise that I'm looking at, so I'm just going to zoom into 200% so you can actually see that noise. The ISO is slightly raised, and in combination with the underexposure, this has caused some issues with noise here. So we're going to suppress that noise using the noise reduction luminance slider. And I'm going to take that up perhaps to around about +40 in order to create a slightly smoother tone. I don't want to raise it so high that I render some of these textures plastic. I want to leave a little bit of texture into those areas. Okay, and I'll fit on screen again Command 0 or Control 0. Okay, we're pretty much ready to open this image now that I've prepared it for the shadows into the main editing space of Photoshop. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll click on my Open Object button. If you're seeing Open Image here, just hold down the Shift key, or you can click on the Workflow options and select the Open in Photoshop as Smart Objects, which will become the new default if you decide to work non-destructively inside of Photoshop. So I'll just select OK and then click on the Open Object button. And this will open the file. You'll see we don't have a background layer, we have a raw file embedded in a smart object. I'm just going to again fit on screen, Command 0 or Control 0 just to fit on screen. Okay, and now we're going to create another version of this file that we can process independently for the values in the sky. Now we're not going to use the keyboard shortcut for duplicating this layer, which is Control J or Command J on a Mac. We're not even going to drag it to the new layer icon, which would also duplicate it. What we need to do is, because we want to make an independent or different edit to this raw file, we're going to have to right click on the layer and choose New Smart Object via Copy. This means that if we edit the contents of this smart object, it won't roll down or flow through to the original smart object. These settings on the base smart object layer will stay the same. Okay, so we're going to come back into the file just by double clicking on the Smart Object thumbnail to edit the contents inside of Adobe Camera Raw. I'm just going to hit the default value, which will zero the sliders in this basic panel except for the ones in the presence section here, which includes the clarity, vibrance and saturation. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to make the sky a little bit darker, maybe take out a quarter or a third of a stop there just to make it a little bit darker, but I'm going to significantly reduce the highlights here, perhaps all the way down to 100 there. Now I'm just going to give a little bit more contrast in that sky by raising that white slider perhaps to plus 20 or so, just to give a little bit more depth to those clouds. Okay, I'm going to leave the clarity set at 25, but I'm going to raise the saturation slider to give a lot more color into there. I'm going to push that up quite a long way, perhaps to as much as plus 80, to give some nice colors in that sky there. The saturation slider in this instance is probably doing a better job than the vibrance, because it's actually targeting some of these warmer colors, which the vibrance slider doesn't tend to target by default. Okay, if you wanted additional texture or depth in that sky, we could raise the clarity slider even further if we wanted to. I'll just push that up to plus 50. Okay, now we've processed the sky, we're going to open this into Photoshop. So we'll just select the OK button here, and this will update the preview inside of the main editing space of Photoshop. Now our task is to get the best of the sky on the top layer and the foreground information on the lower layer. So we're going to do this using a layer mask. Okay, so we're going to click on the Add Layer Mask icon. You can see I've got the top layer selected, and then we'll just click on Add Layer Mask to empty this empty layer mask. We're now going to select the gradient tool. Just press G on the keyboard in order to select that gradient tool, and the gradient we're looking for is the black-white gradient here. Okay, now I'm using a linear gradient. The mode is set to normal, and we're working with 100%. Okay, and I'm going to come into the image area. I'm just going to start by this couple in the center of the frame here, and I'm going to click and drag up just north of the spire of St. Paul's Cathedral there. Okay, and that gives us a nice transition between the two exposures. I'll just Command Z and just go through a couple of alternatives. If you drag a gradient that's a little bit too short, then the gradient is going to become a little bit too obvious, the transition. Okay, if we want to fade out the sky a little bit lighter on the horizon line, then we could drag the gradient a little bit higher in the sky, like so, and now we're getting sort of a lighter sky tone towards that horizon line. I think I was favoring the first option there, so I'll Command Z one more time, start in the middle of these two pedestrians here, and then move up just north of that top spire on St. Paul's Cathedral, like so. Okay, now the cathedral in the center of the image is looking a little bit dark here, and I just want to brighten that up a little bit. I'm just going to zoom in a couple of times, just using the keyboard shortcut Command plus, that'd be Control plus on a PC. And I'm going to come over to the toolbar and select the Quick Selection tool. That's W on the keyboard there. And we're just going to, with the Auto Enhance selected here, I'm just going to increase the size of the brush just by using the square bracket keys, okay, next to the letter P on the keyboard, and I'm tapping the close square bracket key just so I can make a selection of St. Paul's there. If I want to select the top spire there, this brush is going to be too large, so I'm just going to reduce that brush to really quite a small brush there, and then just stroke that in order to add that to the selection. I'm going to come to the Edit menu and choose Fill, and we're going to fill this with the foreground color. Now I'm going to use the contents as black. We could use foreground color if we have black in the foreground, but if you don't have that color in the foreground, then just come over and select black from this menu instead. And we're going to work with 100% opacity here, and then select OK. and that brings back the much brighter exposure that is on this base layer here. Now it's probably a little bit too bright, and so we're just going to fade this fill. Okay, now if we come up to the edit menu, we can see the fade command here. This is only accessible immediately after you've done the previous command. If you were to go and do another couple of things prior to coming to this menu, this would be grayed out and would no longer be an option. So we must visit this as the very next thing after filling this selection. Okay, so I'll click on the fade fill command. This brings up the fade dialog, and then I can just grab on the slider and fade that back down, and so it looks just a little bit more natural into the setting there. Somewhere between 60 or 70% will suffice here, and then I'll select OK. I'm now going to lose that selection by going to select menu and choosing deselect. Okay, if we take a look at the mask here, I'm just going to press down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a mask and click on that layer mask. You can see what we've done is we've actually protected that area from this graduated filter, so we're getting a much more of the lower exposure on that base layer. And I'll just Alt or Option click that again to return to the normal view. I'm going to fit on screen now Command 0 on a Mac or Control 0 on a PC, and we're going to move forward with some graduated filters or gradients in order to build a little bit more drama. Now we can do this in the main editing space, but we probably have a little bit more flexibility to modify the way we can add gradients in the main editing space. Because we can't work directly onto the smart object layers, we do have to add these gradients into new empty layers. So I'm going to click on the new layer icon at the base of the layers panel. I'm just going to double click on the name and call it gradient 1, and this will be just hit the caps lock key by mistake there, gradient 1. And this one will be going into the sky, and we're going to try and darken the sky with the color we're going to add. So we're going to use one of the darkening blend modes, multiply there. Now I'm going to select the gradient tool, and I'm going to sample a color from the sky. Now I'm just going to hold down the Alt or Option key, which brings up the sampling tool or the eyedropper tool here. Okay, if you don't see this color or this icon, then just make sure you do have your eyedropper tool set to a higher sample size. Typically a point sample isn't very useful for editing photography images. It's better to move over to a higher average, such as a 5x5 or even an 11x11 with these higher resolution images that we're working with today, and also set the sample to all layers. Okay. We return to the gradient tool now. This allows me to hold down the Alt Option key and sample the color that we can see. Even though the empty layer has no color in it, we've sampled the color in the preview, and as you can see, that has moved into the foreground color swatch now. So I'm just going to click towards the top of the image with the gradient tool, hold down my mouse button, and then holding down the Shift key as well, just drag the gradient down to just north of that spire of St. Paul's. Now I've made a little bit of a mistake here. I've added that black-white gradient, which is actually not what I wanted to do. So I'm just going to do Command Z to undo that. And one of the options I forgot to change was now that we have a new foreground color, I actually want to work with the second option here, which is the foreground to transparent. So let's try that one more time. Foreground to transparent, again coming into the sky at the top of the image, click and drag, holding down the Shift key to constrain that to a perfect vertical, and there we're adding a nice, very warm, rich tobacco sky into the top of this image. Okay, if this is a little bit strong, we can just lower the opacity of that sky. Here I'll push it back down to something like 80%. Okay, we're going to try and use this color to be reflected in the wet paving stones on side of the bridge. There's a small hint of that old color there, but we're going to try and now replicate or reflect the very strong colors inside of the foreground here. So I'm going to sample that again. We're going to sample a slightly stronger color this time. As you'll see, the color becomes quite a lot richer in that foreground color. Now I'm not going to add this in. I could add this into the gradient layer, but I'm going to separate these out so I can work with them independently, so I can adjust the opacity of each of the gradients separately. So I'm going to click and add a new empty layer, and we'll call this gradient 2. Okay, and we're going to now add the foreground gradient into this layer. Now if I was not to select any blend mode now, you'll see that it'll just be applied as quite a heavy wash overlay, which won't look very natural at all. It's really the blend modes that help these graduated filters settle in. Now if I was to select the multiply mode as we did before, the whole foreground probably gets a little bit too dark, and I'm not getting the richness of colors that I actually wanted to achieve here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of the contrast blend modes instead. I'm going to choose the overlay blend mode. Okay, now that gives me a lot more localized contrast in here, and also introduces that color. I can introduce that or enhance that color even further by bringing up one of the adjustment features. We can come up to the image adjustments and choose hue saturation, or we can use that keyboard shortcut, which is Command U or Control U on a PC, in order to bring up the hue saturation dialog. This gives me the option of now playing with that color value that we're adding to this foreground. For instance, I can increase the saturation of that color and also make that color slightly darker. We could also change the hue of that color, which is not actually something I want to do in this project, because we're not going to be reflecting the color that's in the sky. So I'll just double click the word hue in order to zero that hue slider. I'm happy with the increased saturation and the modified lightness, however, so I'm just going to apply this adjustment directly to that layer. Okay, now we've got the image looking quite dramatic. I'm going to finish this image up, not in the main editing space, but I'm going to return to Adobe Camera Raw. But rather than taking individual layers back into the Adobe Camera Raw dialog box, for instance, I could take in the foreground information and modify that. But you can see none of the other adjustments that we've been making. All of those are left behind in the main editing space. So I'll cancel out. And what I'll do is, with the base layer selected, and I'm just going to hold down the Shift key and click on that top layer. Okay, and then I'm going to right click and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now, two of these layers are already smart objects, but we're actually wrapping all 4 layers into a new smart object now. Okay, and what we can do now is we can come over to the Filter menu and choose Camera Raw Filter. Okay, now this does take all 4 layers back inside of Adobe Camera Raw, so we can edit them as if they were one image. Okay, one of the things I want to do now is to add a vignette to darken the edges, but I'm also noticing the image is probably getting a little bit dark for me now, so I'm just going to open up this image in brightness, perhaps as much as 2/3 of a stop, and maybe even add a little bit of contrast and a little bit of saturation to this image. Okay, so I get the central portion of the image how I want to see it. Okay, and now we're going to come over to a radial filter to add this vignette. Okay, there are obviously alternatives for adding vignettes, but this is actually going to give me a lot more control about the look of the vignette that I'm hoping to achieve here. So we'll click on that radial filter. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're just going to click on the minus exposure value. That will take it down to minus half a stop. Now at the base of this panel, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be editing the outside, because I want to be darkening the outside. But not only do I want to darken the outside, I also want to increase the saturation, maybe raise that up to +50. Maybe the clarity as well, give some localized definition into the edges there, and maybe also the contrast. And obviously this is the increased flexibility of working with vignettes in this radial filter, is we're not just working with luminance values, we can work with multiple values here. Okay, so clicking in the center, just in St. Paul's, and then clicking and pulling down towards the lower edge here, and you can see that we're adding quite a lot of impact now to the edge of that image. And I can also move this gradient around if I want to change the focus for this vignette. Okay, I'm reasonably happy with that now, so I'll just return to the basic panel. Just click on the hand or the zoom tool there to come out, and maybe just a little bit more exposure. Okay, and bringing that up nearly to 1 stop increase now, and then select OK. Now as we come back into the main editing space, you can see the image is improved yet again. Now we've worked with a completely non-destructive workflow here. If we want to modify any of those settings of that last vignette, then we can just double click on that camera raw filter, and they're all there to be adjusted again. Okay, I'll cancel that out. If I want to access any of the 4 component layers, for instance the foreground gradient or the upper gradient, then I can just double click on the Smart Object thumbnail, and that opens up my multi-layered file, and this gives me access to each individual component within this image. Okay, if I make any changes here, I would save them and then close the file. So for instance, if I just want to lower the opacity of that foreground gradient, I could just do that and then hit Command S on a Mac or Control S on a PC to save those changes, and then use the keyboard shortcut Command W on a Mac or Control W to close that file, and that will upgrade the preview inside of the main editing space now with those modifications in place. Okay, so quite in this project we've seen that how we can edit not only non-destructively but also make use of the double processing technique to get the optimum exposures for different areas of the image.